Oh, that's light. Good.
Hi, Tom. So we're good to go whenever you're ready.
Okay, good. Right. Greetings, everybody, and welcome to the second keynote of the conference. And just a note of thanks to all of the organizers for putting together such a great program and for organizing and publicizing it so well. It's really a pleasure to be asked to be part of it. Our next keynote speaker is an American science fiction writer who's very well positioned to contribute to our conference discussion on pandemics and the end time. Kim Stanley Robinson is one of the leading public intellectuals of our time. He's the author of over 20 books, including the internationally best-selling Mars trilogy, as well as his three Californias trilogy, Red Moon, New York 2140, Aurora, Shaman, Green Earth, and 2312. He went to the Antarctic with the U.S. National Science Foundation's Antarctic Artists and Writers Program in 1995 and returned in their Antarctic Media Program in 2016, the first experience of which led to his novel, Antarctica. Stan works with the Sierra Nevada Research Institute, the Clarion Writers Workshop, and UC San Diego's Arthur C. Clarke Center for Human Imagination. His work has been translated into 25 languages and won a dozen awards in 5 countries, including the Hugo, Nebula, Locus, and World Fantasy Awards. In 2018, he was named a Hero of the Environment by Time Magazine, and in 2016, asteroid 72432 was named Kim Robinson. His most recent novel is Ministry of the Future, yet another powerful work from this hardworking writer, one that is a powerful compendium, and when you read it, you'll see why it's a compendium, of insight and wisdom for our time as it exposes our overdetermined complexity of planetary crises, but also explores possible next steps of critical transformation that can begin to counter those crises and deliver a better world for humanity and all of nature. Stan is a writer, a teacher, and an activist in his own right, who has dedicated his critical and creative work to addressing our complex planetary crises, not only to understand them, but to change them for the better. At his very core and throughout his work, he is a true utopian, one who speaks to our planetary condition from a standpoint of engaged knowledge and activist hope. I'm very honored tonight to present to you Kim Stanley Robinson. Stan.
Well, thank you, Tom, for that kind introduction. And I'm really happy to be here. I think it's worth mentioning the 200 conference attendees and the 42 countries they come from. And, you know, in the ordinary course of things, we might be meeting in person, and that would be a wonderful experience. But as it is, there's lots of us here that couldn't have made it to a live conference anywhere, perhaps including me. And so this is what we've got, and it's wonderful to see the way that it's going. And I wonder what will happen in the future to conferences like this, where a good part of the joy was meeting and sharing food and drink with other people in person. But it was also a giant carbon burn as well. And I'm wondering if regionalization of academic conferences, because surprisingly, or maybe not, there were groups like this within 100 kilometers of you, typically, and it's a matter of finding them and meeting. And so maybe that's the way things will evolve going forward. But in the meantime, I want to start by noting, well, thanking Emra and everybody else associated with the conference, and noting that the conference program, 175 pages long, I read it in full, and it realized as I was reading that it is one of these group novels, that it's like J.G. Ballard's short story that was written in the form of an index. It's a peculiar formal experiment, and the group authorship is very much like that group Wu Ming, Chinese for Anonymous, a group of Italian academics that started with 5, now there are more. They wrote the novel Q together, and so here we have some 200 authors, 209 authors from 42 countries writing a novel. And the contents, reading it all at once as I did, is almost overwhelming, extremely lurid, exotic, melodramatic. And since obviously it's a Gothic novel, I think it's momentarily appropriate to even say hysterical. It's science fiction, fantasy, it's a post-apocalypse, it's all these genres which Jean Clute has usefully termed fantastica, using the Polish word. This is the novel that this conference has assembled, and reading it all at once, it's as I say, almost overwhelming, and an expression, as art so often is, of the cultural subconscious of our current moment. And our current moment, let's just briefly say that we stand at a point in history where the next 50 years could lead us to either utopia or dystopia, either to a prosperous and well-functioning civilization that's integrated with the biosphere in ways that are sustainable and just to both people and other living creatures, or to a mass extinction event as the dystopian or post-apocalyptic or apocalyptic ending. And it's this extreme range of real possibilities from the current moment that makes us deranged and is part of the affect of our time. And one result of that derangement is, of course, repression. And the repression is of the coming impacts of climate change and the end of the fossil fuel era. That's being repressed by our culture. And this conference, therefore, represents the return of the repressed. And as has been noted often, the return of the repressed is often more violent than the original repressed material even would have been. You get the Gothic nightmare, you get the sleepwalking at the edge of the cliff, you get here be monsters as a feeling of nightmarish awareness just barely held under the floor of consciousness, that we are sleepwalking on the edge of a cliff, as in Gothic novel style. And therefore, this conference, when it was put out as a call to the academic community to contribute, it touched a nerve. And it's a literature that I sometimes call needle in the eyeball literature. So that the nerve that gets touched is touched by a needle going through the eyeball. Sentences are often needle in the eyeball sentences, sometimes entire books are. And so this conference is both a symptom and a diagnostic of the time that we're in. It has an aesthetic coherence that has come together from all of the contributors, and perhaps from the curators choosing appropriately and organizing into the various panels that are there. So despite it being even more of a heteroglossia than usual in the novel, because novels are always that way, this one is quite the polyvocal accomplishment. And my congratulations to everybody. And if in theory, I guess stretched out over time as in a time machine, one could see all of the contributions on YouTube, it would be quite a thing. So, well, my own contribution to, since relative to the subject material of most of the presentations at this program, my own material is, you might call it mundane. That's what we would call it in the American science fiction community, a rather mundane contributor, but I do have a secret, perhaps repressed subconscious literature myself, and my own novel contribution to this is my not yet released Vampires versus Zombies. I haven't unleashed it on the world because I'm not sure that it's ready for it yet, and it's sure to be extremely dangerous when released. And it's written nightly, at least in my head, and I worry that it is perhaps a too obvious allegory for our own times. Vampires being, of course, the 1%, macro parasites. And this is a term from William McNeill, the great world historian who wrote The Rise of the West. One of his other books was called Plagues and Peoples, and it was about the effect of pandemics on human history. And near the end of that book, when he was doing his summation of what it all meant, he made distinctions between microparasites, which were the bugs like the virus afflicting us now, like bacteria, like the Black Death in the Middle Ages, and macroparasites, which were simply the ruling class sucking our blood and making us sick. And it's no coincidence, of course, that vampire stories appeared around the time of the rise of imperialist capitalism. And then, of course, the sickness that the vampires infect us with is simply zombieism. The precariat, all of us, the rest of us. And very coherently and insightfully, zombies are split up between fast zombies and slow zombies. And the fast zombies are the ones who are getting by, and the slow zombies are the ones too slow to make it, falling apart as they walk and try to survive. So that the difference between fast and slow zombies is essentially can be determined by looking at their bank balance and how much of an infusion of cash they're getting per month, if any. So the final battle of vampires versus zombies would be a classic Ragnarok ending, and a real Donnybrook. Vampires they have small mouths. They're not great predators. They're not Tyrannosaurus Rex. They have small mouths. And of course, there are small mouthed creatures that are quite effective killers. Otters in particular. The indigenous people, especially in North America, were aware that otters, as playful as they looked, were the most vicious killers of all, and they have very small mouths. And then zombies are not particularly competent warriors either. They tend to fall apart. They're often very slow. The Ragnarok of the vampires versus zombies is likely to be an incompetent mess of a battle, and we sort of saw a cosplay version of that last week. But you can imagine the final scene, because the Ragnarok should have a watery end, could be in a gigantic whirlpool of blood and mutual assured destruction, with both sides going down together. Now, you'll notice that there is no story named Vampires versus Zombies, and that isn't just because I'm considering making it a registered trademark. I looked it up, and there is one 16 millimeter film shot entirely inside an automobile called Vampires versus Zombies, but I take it that that isn't the final word on the subject. And really the reason that it isn't a very famous TV show, I think, is that perhaps everybody recognizes that this is too dangerous of an idea, too dangerous of a story to unleash on the world right now. It might be a kind of cultural black hole that sucked the entire world into it. So aside from registering the trademark and rewriting the story in my head every night in my insomniac hours, I will choose to unleash the story at a suitable time when the needle in the eyeball can go deepest. So end times, Ragnarok, Atlantis, etc. The interesting thing is that we talk about end times, but there never really is an end to history. So a conference on end times is a symptomatic of the way things feel now, but perhaps a category error in and of itself. I recently did an online Zoom event with the great young astrophysicist Katie Mack, who has written a book called The End of Everything. And her book, being an astrophysicist, is about the end of the history of the universe. Will it end in a big crunch? Will it end in a diffusion, a heat death of the universe? The the court is still out amongst the physics theorists as to how the universe might end. And Katie runs us through all the possibilities, which tend to range from 50 billion years to infinity off into our future. But that's the real end. Otherwise, not. Things tend not to end. And of course, there are, of course, extinctions. Species do come to an end. So maybe that's what we're talking about here. But humans, even with climate change, even with the poisoning of the earth and the creation of a mass extinction event that will hammer the rest of the Earth's biosphere's living creatures, humans are going to persist like cockroaches or sharks, like crows or seagulls or ants. There's a certain unkillability to the human social, our capabilities in the world are adequate to keep us alive through hard times. And so there won't be a true end. The average lifetime of a species is around 10 million years. So we are at the notional 1% mark in the lifetime of our species. And of course, everybody then says, but wait, we're so stupid. We are an evolutionary accident that has flown off the handle in terms of being too clever by half, is the British phrase that would describe it. But perhaps too clever by, powers of 10, and are very unlikely to last 10 million years. But on the other hand, sharks have lasted 300 million years. So the potential is there for humanity to be squeaking by, even if a dark age were to come, even if the dark age were to be very long. There isn't going to be an ending, and that's inconvenient for stories where endings are a satisfactory conclusion, a sense of closure, sense of an ending in the Frank Kermode sense. But the reason I think that we will squeak by has to do with our Homo faber, man the maker, the technological capabilities that we have. And I want to remind everybody of a time 73,000 years ago when there was a volcanic event, as there has been many times in terms of climate change. And this is the discussions of nuclear winter in the early 1980s suddenly clarified what really bad volcanic explosions could do to the climate of the Earth. And we now know, by way of archaeological investigation of the human genome, that around 73,000 years ago, there was a volcanic explosion, probably in the Indonesian archipelago, that was so severe that darkness lasted, or not, perhaps not total darkness, but in any case, cold darkness, disruption, atmospheric poisoning, to the point where humanity was reduced to a population of perhaps 2,500 individuals. And most of them were probably surviving on the coast of South Africa, where there was a confluence of oceanic stabilization of the temperatures, a lot of clam beds offshore, and a particular kind of tuber that grew directly onshore, so that within a day's travel, there was both seafood and plant food that could be gathered, such that no matter what else happened, this little population remnant survived on the coast of South Africa. And it made me think about a couple of things, this newly discovered incident in human history, this near extinction event that happened to us when we had not much particular in the way of technology beyond stone tools and fire itself, that the Neanderthals and Denisovians were also alive at that time and went extinct sometime perhaps 30,000 to 40,000 years later. So it's not necessarily the case that that particular volcanic explosion put them under, but they lived further north. Remember that at this time, Australia was empty, the Americas were empty, probably, and humans had only 20 or 30,000 years before left Africa by way of Arabia. and were walking out into the Eurasian continent, the old world, and diffused. And in the north, there were cousin species that were like us, but not. They actually could mate and reproduce. We have 4% of our DNA is Neanderthal DNA for all of us, and there might be some Denisovian in there too. But these cousins of ours did go extinct. So it's not as if endings don't happen sometimes, but scraping through with the very small technological resources and knowledge base that we had at that time is one sign of how resilient we are. And I want to remind people that Plato, telling the story of Atlantis, was telling the story of the, again, a volcanic event, the eruption of Santorini, the, in fact, violent explosion of the cone of Santorini reduced to a ring of rock island around a central bay, so that Plato's description of the shape of Atlantis is based obviously on the shape of the island of Santorini after the explosion. And that happened about 1,000 years before Plato or whoever wrote it down in Plato's voice wrote it down. And in that 1,000 years, there was no writing. So this was oral memory holding on to something that had happened. For 1,000 years, that story persisted around the, told around the fire at night by storytellers of all kinds, either shamans doing it in formal style, or else just people telling the stories that they'd heard from their parents and from the elders around the fire. And Atlantis is approximately 10 times larger than the real Santorini. So 10 times exaggeration of scale over 1,000 years is really a modest kind of exaggeration. And it made me wonder if how long an oral story could last in culture, and how many old stories, once writing began, were lost to culture. And it made me wonder, to the point that I one time wrote down what might have been said around the fire about this event 73,000 years ago. And this was when I was writing about the Chauvet Cave. So this would have been 30,000 years ago. And so 40,000 years after the event. Back in the old time, we lived like birds. We pecked and shivered and did what we could in every season, rain, snow, or shine. But once there was a time, they say, once in that time when we lived so far south that the sun stood in the north of the sky, came a year when summer failed to return. Spring didn't come, nor summer after it. It stayed bad cold, though the days got long, cold and stormy through spring, summer, and fall, cold right through to the following winter with never a chance to gather food. And then it happened the next year too. And the year after that, yes, never a summer. No, nothing but winter. Yes, winter for 10 long years. And if it were not for the Great Salt Sea, everybody everywhere would have died and been dead, and no more people on this Mother Earth. We ate what lived through 10 years of winter, meaning whelks and clams and mussels and sea snails, meaning seaweed and sand crabs and limpets and eels. We ate fish when we could catch them. We ate shit when we couldn't. So, maybe that's how it went. Hard to say, but stories persist, and humans persist too. And how long we remember things like the long winter is part of our end time stories. And speaking of the long winter, reminded me that the great American novel could be argued to be The Long Winter, a Little Home on the Prairie novel by Laura Ingalls Wilder, or Wilder. Yeah, I think it's Ingalls Wilder. There was a long winter in the Dakotas in the 1880s that people had to live through. And there again, you have an end time where people got through it by way of solidarity and working together. And that, I think, is the time to make the shift to the idea of end time tales are tales of fear. We have fears, and fear is powerful, really powerful. It maybe is one of the strongest emotions, but hope is also a strong emotion. And I want to suggest to you that hope persists in ways that are usually invisible to us. And also, for instance, um, hunger. When you feel hunger, this is your cells hoping to persist and sustain themselves. Hunger is a hope for life. And it's a good illustration of the persistence of hope. It's ineradicability that we're always feeling a little hungry. And indeed, it's the lack of physical hunger. So seldom do we feel it in the developed world when we're at the upper half of the precariat. There are 20% of the US population and probably more of the world population that feel hunger on an almost daily basis. But for a lot of us, it's not actually felt in a way that can't be immediately satiated and satisfied. So we forget how important hunger is and how much it represents a hope. And this is a good place to acknowledge that my friend and who introduced me into this session, Tom Moylan, has been a crucial figure in redefining utopia and dystopia as a dialectic that, as in any dialectic, has more than just those two simple terms. But you can say as a first cut that dystopia is a story of our fears and utopias are stories of our hopes. But also, just as there's utopia and dystopia, you have to do the Greimas rectangle on it, and you get to the anti-utopia. And indeed, this is now a truism that in the Society of Utopian Studies and in the general utopian community, that there is the thing that is not utopia, that is the dystopia, but there's the thing that is opposed to the idea of utopia, that is the anti-utopia. So that the classical examples are well known to all. The dystopia, the powers that be are trying to make you miserable. So this would be 1984. The boot is on the neck. And the anti-utopia, people in the powers that be tried to make everybody happy. But this is a mistaken category error of a different kind. You can never do that. And if you try to make people happy, it will rebound on your head. And this is the anti-utopia. And again, a famous novel, Brave New World, is often quoted as the example of the anti-utopia. And then the fourth term in the Greimas rectangle, extremely useful, would then be, I mean, this is often a mysterious term, being neither the reversal or the dialectical turn against either the not or the against. What do you get there? But in this case, clear, the anti-utopia. In other words, you have to be against those who are opposed to utopia systemically and in a coherent way. And just recently, the climate activist Bill McKibben, wonderful founder of 350.org, talked about my ministry for the future as an anti-dystopia. And that sort of simplifies our more academic and theoretical and dialectical. The anti-utopia takes some unpacking, which is not a bad thing. But the idea of the anti-dystopia is a good one. And I'm glad to have it applied to my book and introduced into the world. Because this feeling of the end times that we're in is the repressed feeling of a mass extinction event that we are creating. The Anthropocene as mass extinction event coming down on us, repressed, then a return of the repressed, and all of the cultural phenomenon that you're going to be talking about in your conference here. But what occurs to me now is that dodging the mass extinction event is a kind of anti-dystopia, but it's also a new and maybe lowest bar ever definition of utopia itself. That dodging a mass extinction event is the utopia for our time. It's the slogan, the definition. Let's get through this century without triggering a mass extinction event, which can never be recovered from, even if humans squeak through like cockroaches. The mass extinction event means many species, including, of course, the great mammals, our closest cousins, the most charismatic megafauna, the most beautiful creatures on the planet, gone forever. And the biosphere is robust. New species will evolve. 20 million years later, the situation will be recovered from. But this is a cold comfort to us. And we need to dodge that mass extinction event as a kind of moral imperative. So I want to end with a quick discussion of can that be done? From where we are right now, the trajectory that we're on, can we indeed dodge a mass extinction event? And I think the answer is yes, we can. Is it physically possible as a matter of what you could call ecological and even energy flows in the physics sense? Yes, it is. Is it technologically possible? Have we invented the technology that can keep 8 billion people alive while also not causing a mass extinction event? Yes, the answer to that is also yes. There's room for improvements, but even with already existing technologies, if we could replace our current technological base with this newly invented technological base that is already existing fast enough, then yes, it's technologically possible also to avoid the mass extinction event. So then it's socially. Is it possible socially? And of course, there's the rub. That's the big maybe of our time. That's where you get to express your opinion, your fundamental judgment of human nature, which I think is very clearly partly a construct and partly a biological reality. This is what makes sociobiology of interest to all leftists and should be to everybody. What are we as social primates? What have we evolved from? What does that leave us with now in terms of our capabilities? And even there, the answers are quite positive. We're a social primate. And I think the pandemic is one of the things that's taught us that we are social primates who suffer a little when deprived of other people's company, including their touch, but also gathering together. A highly cooperative species. This is secret to our success. It's why we have managed to enslave animals much stronger than us, so that 97% of the meat on this planet is humanity and their domestic beasts, enslaved wild animals that have been turned into industrial products for food for us, etc. And that, of course, that social ability, that ability to cooperate, has the downside that can make us slave owners in this world. And of course, other humans have suffered that fate as well, and still do in everything but in precise names. But on the other hand, the upside of that is social cooperation is real, biological, and inherent, has to do with language and everything else that we do. One name for it that I like that comes out of the essentially the leftist critical community is social reproduction. Another name for this, an earlier one out of anthropology that is somewhat connected to it, is the gift economy. That before capitalism and before the slave economies of the ancient world that followed agriculture and patriarchy, there was perhaps a gift economy of people sharing what they made and living together in a cooperative way that didn't have to do with monetary exchanges. And we still have social reproduction in the modern world, which is to say all the things that people do to reproduce people themselves that don't get paid for, that aren't jobs. And indeed, it would be weird and awful to try to monetize social reproduction itself, which is having to do with care and with giving, and a kind of gift economy that is daily. And it isn't just immediate family, but mostly people that you are in physical proximity to, so that they're your community rather than your network. Right here, we are speaking as a network, and that's very important, especially for intellectuals, but it may be everybody, to have a network. But then there's also your community that cannot be neglected without suffering at every level. So you could say that, for instance, this conference is a upshot of the gift economy. there is social credit that comes from it that can redound to a livelihood, to economic benefit to those participants in it. A credit on a CV, possible job opportunity in a more tenuous world. For the precariat, every little bit helps. And in that sense, this conference is an economic activity, but so much of it is also created by the gift. I'm sure that there were scores of individuals that put the conference together as an active thing, but then also this is a science fictional thought that Charlie Stross, the Scottish science fiction writer, has been very good on. How many people does it take to keep a civilization going? It's one of the ways you can destroy the multi-generational spaceship idea, which I'm interested to destroy and have in my novel Aurora. Stross says you probably need 100 million people to run this conference. That is to say, to build the machines, to run the programming, to design the algorithms. And some of that was gift economy too, people doing it for the fun of programming and of making something new and different that then got incorporated as capital, as the useful residue of human labor, but capital invented and given for free, so that there's capital that's separate from capitalism as a system of oppression and control. So yes, there isn't going to be an end, and yet it's still valid to talk about end times as an affect state, as the feeling of our moment of history. Something's going to end. We can't go on the way we're going, and what can't happen won't happen. We are not in a fantasy novel. We are in a science fiction novel. So magic isn't going to work. But there is a certain magic to the feeling of cooperation and of solidarity with strangers. So, and also, literature and art in general is made to unleash the monsters and put them on stage and talk about them, enjoy their presence without damaging other people. In a way, science fiction is just a subset of a larger fantastica, as Clute and my students are always pointing out to me. So without canceling this conference, I will now cancel this talk, or let's put it this way, the talk indeed has come to an end. And I'm going to turn it back over to Tom and hope that we will have a entertaining question and answer session. Tom?
Thank you, Stan. Very good. I think we're ready to go, and the questions are already rolling in. I feel more like a host on a radio program with all the questions coming in. Let's start with this one. I can find it again, which is very immediate, from Simon Spiegel. KSR wrote at the beginning in the New Yorker that the corona is rewriting our imagination. Would you still hold to that? To me, at the beginning, it felt similarly, but it is dragging on. I have problems to see it that way.
Yes, well, thank you, Simon, an acquaintance of mine, and an interesting question. I have to say, and a lot of you will recognize this situation, that titles in journalism are typically, like headlines, not written by the writer. And it was not my phrase. The coronavirus is rewriting our imaginations. I'm not sure that I agree with that, and I'm not sure that the essay that they published would back that thought. But it certainly, like a good headline, grabbed a lot of attention to the essay itself. Written in April as it seemed to me then that something that I'd been saying for years is definitely the case. We are all now living in a science fiction novel that we are co-writing together, in the same way that this conference has written the program as a collaborative novel. Civilization itself is caught up in a science fiction novel. And someone has pointed out to me recently that it's not just one science fiction novel, it's competing science fiction narratives, and maybe Fantastica in general, but in any case, not mundane domestic realist novels of the bourgeois tradition in England and France. We're not in that world anymore, and that kind of novel is a nostalgic thing. as for the pandemic and its effects on us, well, it's an ongoing science fiction story. We learned a lot. And a lot of what I said then, I would stand by. Now it's been borne out that we are utterly reliant on what science is teaching us, that science is artificial intelligence in the same way that vampires are the 1% and zombies are the precariat. AI is science. It's a very plain allegory. And every time we talk about fear of AI taking over, this is people speaking either consciously or not about fear of science taking over and the disappearance of philosophy or ethics or simply executive functions of decision making, which do indeed need to happen. So I think the pandemic has underlined all that stuff, and I would invite people to go back and read the essay I wrote in April on the basis of ignoring the headline and seeing what else I said there.
Thank you. Emra, let me just check with you. As I understand it, we have about 45 minutes until
yes, Tom, I pasted the questions for you in the chat box. So, I mean, we can have a longer, of course, like session if you both are fine. So that wouldn't be any problem.
Yeah, but right now we're aiming to 1/4 past the hour.
Yes. Yes. So I just pasted the questions like in the chat box, so you can.
Well, I'm following the chat, so yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. Okay, Stan, let me move to another. This reads, your description of the anti-dystopia also seems to partake of an anti-apocalypse or an apocalyptic event averted. Do you see any use in the category of a failed dystopia as a counterpart to the failed utopia you exemplify with Brave New World? That is a flawed or seemingly malevolent society which nevertheless fails to actualize misery. If so, what would be an example in fiction or history?
Well, thank you for that, because this would not have occurred to me if it weren't for Tom's own work on the critical utopia and the critical dystopia. This is maybe it's in Demand the Impossible or in the next book of Tom's. And it has to do with his discussion of my novel, The Gold Coast, which has sometimes been talked about as a dystopian novel, whereas actually it's a fairly accurate rendition of my own youthful follies in the 1970s in Orange County, California. And I have to say, there was a lot of joy in the 1970s. And this stupid war economy, the military industrial complex, and Reaganism itself, the Reagan-Thatcher neoliberal counter-revolution that dashed the hopes of the 60s like a Spartan war chief taking an infant baby that was judged to be unfit and smashing its head against a tree and killing it. 1980, there was a cultural turnaround then that for those of us who lived through it was surprising and shocking. And so The Gold Coast is, in that sense, a dark novel about the world that I lived through and that particular cultural transitions feel, its affect state. And so, and yet, you know, we were young. I was body surfing every day. I was writing poetry and playing around with friends. I had girlfriends. It was the Beach Boys. The music of the Beach Boys was not an inaccurate description of the feel of my youth in that. So at sometimes, and this is also by help from Tom, I talk about the pocket utopia. And so many written utopias have been a little separate pocket utopia. And I made the point in my following novel, The Pacific Edge, there can be no such thing as a pocket utopia. That's just simply an island of privilege and a sea of misery. And so I'm wondering then, therefore, if the failed dystopia would be, or incompetent, would be hope, always ineradicably springing up, so that if humans are alive, then they're filled with hunger, with hope, with an urge to joy. And young people will find joy in remarkably awful geopolitical circumstances. So I have to admit that going to my own novels helps me as examples, because it's also the case that in the last 30 to 40 years, I have read much less science fiction than I did in the 10 years before that. So I'm stupendously front loaded in my knowledge of what's going on in science fiction. So this is why I revert to my own work, because it's practically the only thing that I've had time to read.
All right, here's another back to the survival question. I understand that the technological possibilities of survival are at hand, but are you sure there is also a strong enough will to move out of our comfort zones and also to give up the economic and political monopolies that are based on the current technologies that make the planet sick? In simpler terms, does the fact that we can survive mean that we will survive?
Well, no, not automatically. And I very much take the point of this question. It's the lived reality. Anybody's lived reality bulks larger than an imagined future state. And also your current economic standing and security bulks large in everybody's minds relative to any kind of change to any other state. And it's Tom and I, our mutual teacher, Frederick Jameson, talks about the fear of utopia, of doing the right thing, because then you change, and inevitably change is a little death. Will you still be you if society changes radically? And I think it's something to always to talk about, because I think the answer is yes. This is the great Kafavi poem. No matter where you go, you drag yourself with there. You get moved to utopia by some magic wand, and damn it, you're still the same person there. You'll be just as unhappy there as you were anywhere else. But that said, social security, a feeling of security, is real and important. And being confident that you will not become destitute and hungry in your lifetime is a kind of floor. I invoke the Maslowian pyramid of needs and wants, that once you get your needs satisfied, you can begin to want more things. In this case, I say this often to young people, that the so-called comforts of living in the fossil fuel cocoon are often you're cocooned in crap. You are comfortable, but also a little deadened to the world. That living out there without the comforts of modern bourgeois society, as long as you've got some security underneath it, a floor of physical security, a little less crap, but buffering you from the world, is not a bad thing. So in other words, to get to a sustainable and just society, what you give up is often not necessary in the first place and is part of the crap world. And a more stylish, a more satisfying, a more bold, a more engaged life can be led with less carbon burn. And so we're living in a bubble of carbon burn that has given us some habits that we think of as being pleasures. But these are, perhaps unearned, decadent pleasures. They're like eating cotton candy. There's a better world out there that getting to sustainable justice is a project that makes people more content and happier. And then living a lifestyle with a much lower carbon burn is a lifestyle personally that makes people happier and healthier in the end. And health and happiness are synonyms. You're never happy if you're unhealthy. So getting healthy is one of these Maslowian-based steps. So now this is a discursive battle. People not only have to be told it, talked about it, but then they have to try it in their real lives and see whether it works for them or not. So it's part of the discursive battle. And it's really one of the stories that we should be telling, especially to young people who often are forced to try it by way of economic necessity. They can't afford a middle-class life. They live a precariat life, and they're having just as much fun, if not more, than more carbon-burning people. So this is one of those great questions, and this is where maybe art can do a vanguard thing and talk about it.
Okay, this follows on from the discussion. Doctorow has imagined a gift economy in his novel Walkaway. However, what he shows is that we as humans can hardly get rid of the urge to be patted on the back for what we have achieved. Hence, the gift economy is subverted by the reputation economy of likes and shares. What do you think about this issue?
Yeah, that's good. I like Cory Doctorow's work very much. He teaches me. He's one of the younger science fiction writers whom I read because I learn things and I enjoy it. And he's great. And Walkaway is good on these issues. And it resembles also Le Guin's The Dispossessed. If you look at Anares, you see that it's not really an anarchy because there has to be a division of labor. Because it's a technological society. They're living on a moon with scant resources, and it's a modern technological society, and therefore there is a division of labor, DivLab. It's one of Le Guin's little jokes, because a division of labor immediately gets you into bureaucracy, and effectively Anares is not an anarchy, but a socialist state, a successful socialist state. It's implied there that the scant resources and necessity itself drove them to this as the best survivable state for those tough conditions. In a world of plenty, like Eurus and Le Guin, like Earth, maybe we aren't driven to that level of sharing. But what Le Guin shows, and I'll get to Doctorow, is that power corrupts. And of course, absolute power corrupts absolutely, okay, but a little power corrupts a little bit. And almost everybody has a little power. And especially bureaucrats, even if they're given it temporarily and are working at will for the larger commonwealth of the society at large, they have a little power for a little bit of time, and then therefore there's a little bit of corruption. Human nature. Now, I think human nature is such a charged, loaded, and deceptive term. And yet we're not tabula rasa, and there is reputation economy, and it's Paleolithic. You can see that, and you can guess it. So I think Doctorow's right that you can't walk away into a gift economy and have everything become copacetic at that point. And so he is following the Le Guin line of interrogating. It's again, Tom's term, the critical utopia. These are utopias that are criticizing the very idea of utopia as they make suggestions for some kind of better world, a post-capitalist world that one way or another ameliorates the gross inequities of capitalism. And also in Le Guin's case in particular, Doctorow is also good on it, but in Le Guin, the end of patriarchy. The huge success on Anares is not that they've gotten to any kind of utopia of pure anarchic horizontalization and sharing of power, but that they have absolutely erased patriarchy as a force, a negative force of oppression of men over women. That's gone on Anares, Le Guin asserts. And that's the great success in that novel that is not underlined by Le Guin, but very clear if you reread that book. Doctorow tries to make similar efforts. And Walkaway, which is a title that I suggested to him, although I think it should be 2 words, not one, should be an imperative verb, is like many excellent utopian novels, both great and mildly crazy. And I only add that because the ending where they begin to download their minds into computers and these are incompetent versions of their living selves, well, it's just an excrescence. It's unnecessary to the story that he was telling up to that point. But what can you do? Novels are kind of out of one's control and they flounder around, and I know that very well. And I would still say Walkaway is one of the more important books of the last decade. Oh, Tom, you're.
I'm back.
Yep.
Question about hope. Specifically, how can we use literature and stories to create hope for the planet which I think is a more collective kind of hope than what individual happy ends literature often represents. Very interesting.
Yeah. Well, one could, you could do the anti-humanist thing and say, look, we're no more significant than any other of Earth's life forms. And if we happen to drive ourselves extinct or even cause a mass extinction event, 25 million years from now, it's all going to be okay anyway by a re-efflorescing of the evolutionary process, and all the emptied niches that we will have emptied by our bad behavior will refill through the evolutionary process, and there may be langurs or possums. Some evolved next species will take over our niche in some way and maybe do a better job. So hope for the planet isn't really necessary. The planet's doing fine. It's gone through things even more radical than what we're doing to it now. Although I have to say that what we're doing to it now is so fast compared to the radical things that have happened to Earth's biosphere in the past in terms of its timeline, that it could be that there's some kind of shock of the speed of the changes that we've created that will mean an even worse mass extinction event than some of the ones in the past. Although some of those might have happened from instantaneous shock, like the KT boundary asteroid hitting Earth. So speed is relative geologically. But here's, let me get to the point of that question in maybe a more productive way. Aldo Leopold had a slogan, what's good is what's good for the land. So, okay, if you say you become aware that humanity is part of a larger biosphere, and that our health depends on the health of the whole biosphere, that we are creatures of Earth, that we're imbricated with the rest of the living communities, that 50% of the DNA in our bodies is not human DNA, so that we ourselves are like forests or biomes, and for sure, that's why things go wrong in us sometimes. And it's a delicate balance, but we are completely involved with the rest of the planet. So then when you talk about, you can do something that isn't neither anti-human nor a humanism, and say simply a biocentric view. What's good is what's good for the land. So that's an axiom completely ignored by capitalist economics. Where the axiom might be what's good is what's profitable, or what's good for profit. But if you take the axiom to be what's good is what's good for the land, then that too will benefit humans. And you can reorient urban bourgeois precariat people to the idea that their own health and their family's health and their children's health and happiness are all intimately bound up with wild animals, with habitat corridors, with the health of the soil, with the health of the oceans. And these all together make up our collective health. So yes, the planet as the collective, the planet, Jameson used to talk about the ultimate horizon of totalization, and indeed it was an error of Marx and Engels to talk about the human as the ultimate horizon, the social. You see that often asserted in Marxist and post-Marxist thought, that all that really matters is humanity, and we are here to wrest freedom from the realm of necessity, and necessity being nature or the natural world. The horizon just has to be pushed out a little further, maybe, to the entire biological community of Earth being the family. So we have our horizontal brothers and sisters, we have our cousins, we have 938 base pairs in our DNA that are shared with every living thing on Earth. And I don't know if that includes the viruses, because it's debatable how alive these damn things are. But for sure, down to the bacterial level, we are family with everything else. And that needs to be emphasized, and it needs to be incorporated into our socio-economic systems. So again, it's part of the discursive battle.
Well, this one comes back to the question of form and dystopia and utopia. Could we ask Stan to reflect a little more on the term anti-dystopia? In the classic anti-dystopia, say Brave New World, there is usually a leakage of utopia. The anti-utopia can't quite cancel utopia. It has to incorporate more of it than it can handle or negate. Can the same be said of an anti-dystopia? What then is the dystopia the Ministry of the Future sets itself against?
Oh, yeah. Well, thank you for that. I think that's a good description of how things work in Brave New World. And then you can perhaps include Island, Huxley's late novel, as a meditation on that, and even Island Revisited. I think this very question that the questioner has brought up is Huxley was himself investigating throughout his career. My Ministry for the Future is an attempt to tie together the notion that climate change cannot be solved in a capitalist economy, but requires and necessitates a post-capitalist economy. Now, this I find a terrifying thought because we are short of time and because capitalism pretends to be massive and natural and ineradicable. And certainly, there are powers that be within the capitalist system that will viciously resist a change to a post-capitalist system, such that if we're in a big hurry, as we are, to decarbonize our technological base and get into a better balance with the biosphere, we're going to be doing that against intense resistance from powerful forces. So there's the danger that in Ministry of the Future, what I tried to show is that there is maybe a needle's eye that we can thread in the few decades that we have, that we're starting right now, that is perhaps represented by the Paris Agreement. That's the needle's eye through which we might be able to pop a solution that reforms capitalism by way of stepwise and legal means, with perhaps some civil disobedience or nonviolent resistance in order to make it work. Everything from general strikes to non-compliance to non-payment of debt, et cetera, to get through, push our powers that be through that needle's eye, which is stepwise. Anti-austerity, Keynesianism returned, which is now being called modern monetary theory. Full employment, so in other words, government being the employer of last resort. And so everybody on earth having a job and dignity and a floor and adequacy for the life necessities, a sense of security, of social security that comes with that full employment. And there is lots of work to be done. There will be no problem finding jobs. It might not be that these jobs are fulfilling the pure efficiency of capitalist rationality, but that was always a bad efficiency based on evil axioms. The efficiency in this case would be we were getting together in sustainable balance with the biosphere and in justice with each other by way of these stepwise means that might then go on to something you would call social democracy, and then maybe democratic socialism, and then maybe some distant horizon of pure horizontalization of power, which I take it is what the anarchists are talking about. But what I wanted to try in the Ministry for the Future was to describe that happening step by step, with the resistance included, and the anger and violence that might result as a resistance to doing the necessary things. And so in that sense, anti-dystopia is a good way of putting it, anti-utopia. And whenever people argue, and you still hear this argument a lot, oh, if you try to plan a good world, you're power tripping, you are an eco-fascist, you're gonna take over, it can never turn out right, it's better not to plan. And then of course you're obscuring, pretending that there isn't a plan already, which there is. which is the so-called free market, which is just a name that is a complete nonsense name, as so many names are, for a system that is highly regulated and oppressive. It's just as much a planned economy as any other planned economy. It's just that it happens to leave the flex for the 1% to oppress the 99%, using the top 10% as their instruments of oppression. So that was a mighty task. I mean, the year 2019 was a very invigorating year for me, trying to write that book. It broke my brain. All my novels break my brain. I don't make any claims. Almost everybody in this conference is a working writer and definitely an intellectual. So you know what I'm talking about when I say that writing a book is like having obsessive compulsive disorder. And you're lucky if you are compulsed to pick up your obsession, because otherwise you have to flog yourself through it. So it was a weird project is what I'm saying. I enjoyed it thoroughly, and the results are out there for people to judge. People are very conventional in their notions of what a novel is. Many, many readers are very certain that they know what a novel is and that I'm not writing them. I feel I know better. I'm a historian of the novel, an English major. I love weird novels, and formal experiments are, to me, a beautiful thing to run into. And so I'll just say that in this case, this novel is both strange and perfectly normal. Novels always do. What this one does is just maybe a little bit more, I've laid the cards on the table a little more obviously this time around.
Thank you. This continues in the vein. I am interested in your comment distinction of capital given freely. I am wondering if you can speak to the pros and cons of this formulation when thinking of capital taken freely through racial capitalism and its afterlives.
Yeah, well, we would call that, appropriation or exploitation. Both. The normal work of capitalism is a power extraction that the people with the guns and the laws use to extract value from the rest. It's the story of history. So I'm using capital in the term, it's, I think, a standard left definition. The capital is the useful residue of human labor. So there is the natural world, the line out there that we wander through, the other, our cousins and fellow family members, the living creatures, and then also the inert materials, the rocks, etc. And we've managed to cobble together out of that larger world tools and ways to make ourselves comfortable and safer and less sick, less in pain. All that is good, and to the extent, and so knowledge itself, writing the accrued knowledge of all the generations before us that make us what we are, and up to and including language, all these things are can be defined as useful residue of previous humans' labor, and so can be called capital. And I'm going to try to make the distinction that capital will exist even in post-capitalism. The capital is just the useful residue of human labor. This is maybe definitional and not right, but if you take that as the definition, capitalism is the seizure of capital by a small minority oppressing a larger minority who is forced to maintain and create new capital. So that's capitalism, a system of oppression, similar to patriarchy. And so capitalism does take capital, appropriates it. Jason Moore has been very good on this. The eco-Marxists are fabulously good on this, that there used to be the 4 cheaps or the 7 cheaps, the things that could be taken in the world of the previous centuries, other people's work, other people's lives, other people's children, other people's land. And so these 4 cheaps have gone away in this world, and there's a falling rate of profit, and we're in a crisis of capitalism that some in previous eras have cycled through to the next stage of capitalism. Now we've hit the planetary limit. Space is useless. in this particular project of making more capital, of making profit. And so we've hit the limit, and there's a falling rate of profit. There's a crisis. It's wrecking the biosphere and people's lives, and we're in it. So these definitional terms, I think, are useful, but they are all part of a discursive battle that is extremely intense and important.
Okay, a couple of more directly science questions. What do you make of philanthropists proposing geoengineering as a fix for global warming?
Well, this conflates two things that I think both deserve an discussion. Philanthropy is mostly bogus. There are very good social science studies that show that philanthropy mostly helps itself. There should be no such thing as philanthropy, because there should be no such thing as people so rich that out of the goodness of their heart, they give their ill-gotten and illicit gains to the rest of the community. That should have already been taken in taxes or in pre-distribution by cooperative ownership of everybody of the results of our human project, such that there should be no such thing as billionaires, that there should be wage parity. And I've fond of the 1-to-10 wage ratio, with the idea that everybody on earth should be at adequacy, and adequacy meaning real adequacy, including security. And then the 1-to-10 thing is that the richest people on earth would be 10 times that. And 10 times adequacy is amazingly luxurious, as I say in the Ministry for the Future. It's way more than anyone needs. And yet it's a mere fraction of the wealth discrepancy in this world today, where the richest Americans in particular are often making and owning 1,500 times as much as the minimum wage workers. And this is just absurd and obscene. So there shouldn't be philanthropy, because there shouldn't be philanthropists. Now, geoengineering is different. And it's being suggested not so much by philanthropists, but I mean, some of them are interested, but it's also scientists who are thinking we're going to get into an emergency situation in which the ability to cool down the world by technological means, or to in any way ameliorate the damage we're doing to the biosphere by a deliberate, globally scaled effort. So that's a definition of geoengineering that isn't immediately negative. The definition we have now is geoengineering is the proposed technological silver bullet proposed by rich people in order to allow them to keep doing what they're doing without changing anything. So when you define geoengineering that way, naturally it's bad. It's simply bad in advance of the fact by definition. But if you define geoengineering as doing things as planned things as a human community all around this earth, it gets more interesting. And in the Ministry for the Future, I propose that things like sucking the water out from underneath the rapidly moving glaciers in Antarctica, or even staining the Arctic Ocean when its ice cover goes away, or increasing women's rights everywhere such that we have a drop in the human population over time simply from women making full human choices about their lives. That if you think of women's rights or human rights, or the appropriate deployment of language and stories as geoengineering, then geoengineering becomes a different thing. It's probably a stupid word, like artificial intelligence, like free market. We can't engineer the earth, and so it looks hubristic and wrong right from the name itself. I make jokes about geo-begging or geo-finessing to try to inflect that. And I just think it needs to be back on the table in precisely amongst intellectual communities like this one here gathered for this conference. There's a truism now on the left and in intellectual circles, well, geoengineering equals bad. But the moment that millions of people die because of a wet bulb temperature, of a wet bulb 35 temperature, geoengineering is going to be on the table, and it needs to be thought about in advance of the fact. To see what we come up with.
Right. Okay, what do you make of the idea of the Anthropocene as a science fiction novum? And what does this mean for estrangement in the formalist critical tradition?
I love this term. It is an intervention and part of the discursive battle. It was proposed by Paul Crutzen, a Dutch climatologist, in the year 2000. And there was an earlier scientist who made up the word in the first place in the 1980s. E.O. Wilson is good on the history of this word. And it was an intervention precisely by the scientific community, realizing that their warning signals that they had put up to the whole world in the 1990s were being ignored. And the post-war agreement between the scientific community and society at large after World War II was, you fund us, we'll decide what to do with our science, we'll tell you what we've learned, we'll give you new toys and new powers in the world, we'll make better medicine, give us the money, we are the ones who will run the scientific community on our own recognizance because we're better at it than you are. And because of the World War II successes of science, science won World War II for the Allied powers between penicillin, radar, and the atomic bomb. You get a situation where science was sequestered from civilian control like the military would be, because it was conflated with the military in a kind of category error, having been the big force in World War II. When push came to shove and the scientific community went to the world and said, excuse me, our technological base, which we invented, is sorry, we didn't quite notice how bad it would be. It's wrecking the earth, and nothing changed. And it was clear that nothing was going to change. And that's when Crutzen and others quickly picked it up, said, look, we're in the Anthropocene. Geoengineering is happening every day, except it's destructive and bad. And that's why we're calling it the Anthropocene. We're having as much influence on the surface of the earth and on the biosphere as volcanoes, as various gigantic geophysical forces that we would usually think of ourselves as ant-like in comparison to. So, okay, it was a good idea, the Anthropocene, and I think it's right. And I think that we it's gone, this is Jamesonian, and I don't know that he agrees with it. Realism, modernism, postmodernism, these are historical periods, cultural periods, affect states. And postmodernism was very short-lived, 1973 to 2000 or so. And now we're in the Anthropocene. It's a better name. It's folded in all the other names because geological history and human history are conflated into one in a way that is an extremely powerful discursive tool. Now, as usual, something like this enters the academy that you all are part of and that I'm part of too, really, as a kind of fellow traveler or writer in absentia. It gets chewed up. It gets ground into the humanities. Well, what does it really mean? How do we relate it to earlier philosophical terms? What would Deleuze have said about it? It's the shock value of the Anthropocene as a term is possibly a little muffled compared to what it ought to be. But it was a valid attempt to try to periodize history, which again, as Jameson pointed out, we can't help but do, and it's helpful to do it. So if you're gonna periodize history at all, yeah, call it the Anthropocene. Say then that there can be a good Anthropocene or a bad Anthropocene, but it's gonna be Anthropocene from now on out, unless we wipe ourselves out and go back to a dark age. So I love this term. It is a science fiction term, sort of, because it was science that allowed us to learn the stuff to tell that story. But it's a larger cultural intervention of great importance.
This is a follow-on related question. I wonder if the idea that human life will persist thanks to technology is not part of a dangerous Anthropocene narrative or paradigm that allows us to stay in our comfort zone. We break it, we can fix it. Do you think the current moment can help us to reconceptualize or reimagine our ideas of agency and our relationship to technologies?
Yeah, thanks for that. That's a good question. That brings up the problems of scientism. The idea that we break it, we fix it, that we have Promethean powers, that we can science our way out of anything, and really using the word science as a verb is cute, but almost always a sign of faulty thinking that has drifted into scientism, which is regarding science as magic, and it isn't magic. So that it's in medicine where you can best tell how science really works. You go to your local scientist who happens to be your doctor, and you say, "Doctor, I feel sick." And then doctor says, well, let's see if we can diagnose why you feel bad. And they do. And they say, gosh, you've got thus and such, and we can fix that. A lot of us are alive because of that kind of thing, me included, definitely, twice. But sometimes they come to you and they say, oh my gosh, we found out something that we can't do anything about, and you've got about 18 months or 5 months left, and then you're going to die, and sorry, we can't do anything about it. That's science. That is a way of proving right in your gut that it's not magic. You can't science your way out of it. And indeed, the questioner's point is important. We can do enough damage in the next couple of decades that we can't fix it. And it won't be a good Anthropocene, it'll be a bad one. If, say, the oceans acidify to the point where the bottom of the food chain dies in the oceans, if the permafrost melts to the point where we get a gigantic methane load into the atmosphere, there are tipping points in the chaotic math type tipping point in the Earth's climate geophysical systems, including the climate, which is most dynamic, but also the oceans, that if we tip over them, humans are as helpless as ants once again, to reverse that. And people talk, you see people in the humanities or in economics saying, well, we'll just adapt to anything that we do. Humans are adaptable, blah, blah. Even myself in my talk was saying we'd be like cockroaches, well, and survive. That's only true in the most literal sense of a few humans might scrape by through a 1,000-year dark age. This is a bad fate and unavoidable if we cross certain tipping points in the larger geophysical system of the Earth. So I believe that this questioner's point is extremely important, that any easy optimism, what Zizek might once called cruel optimism, of assuring us that we have the technological capacity and the physical capacities, and in theory, the social capacities to get through to a good Anthropocene. No, none of that's guaranteed. And the bad Anthropocene is really, really bad and irreparable. And this is why economists saying that, well, people in the future will be richer than us and smarter than us, and we can do whatever we want now, and we can discount the damage that we're doing. The typical capitalist economic planning for the future is complete crap. It's delusional. And so this is a good thing that this questioner brought up, that the danger of falling into the delusion that we are all powerful, because we're not.
Right, this one focuses in a little more on diet. The specifics of diet and food sustainability are barely addressed in your novels. Given our dominion over non-human animals is a likely cause of COVID-19 and future pandemics, will you consider raising diet change as a possible solution to avoiding climate catastrophe extinction event?
Yeah, I think it's important, and I think it is going to be another mind-boggling set of innovations going forward. If we were to eat lower on the food chain, less meat, more grain, amazingly good repercussions happen for the planet at large. And so there were the moral considerations of killing other sentient beings and eating them, but we've been omnivores. I mean, evolutionarily, we have indeed eaten our cousins and our horizontal brothers and sisters all along. But now with 8 billion of us at the scale, the planetary scale, it would be amazingly helpful to the world biosphere for us to eat lower on the food chain. And everybody should do that, but it's important not to be too prescriptive or puritanical about this, and just lay out the situation as clearly as possible, and hope that people will choose the nutritious and tasty lower food chain choices that are out there. And one particularly can make an argument for immediate cessation of eating beef. And I did talk about this a little bit in Ministry for the Future. I have to admit, in my earlier books, it's basically just a given, but it's so crucial that in Ministry for the Future, I mean, there's 106 chapters in that book. They're short chapters, but at least 4 or 5 of them have to do with precisely this issue. How do you farm so that you draw carbon down into the soil? What would happen if everybody thought that saboteurs had injected mad cow disease in all the cows on the planet? What would happen if it was too dangerous to fish, that you would be that fishing boats would be killed by drones for wild fish, etc. So yeah, I may be late to the game, but I'm very aware that it's an important point. And we need to feed the world, but we can do that in a so much healthier way in every sense that we ought to give it a try. And it's in the developed world, amongst the part of the precariat that isn't that precarious, that isn't going hungry, where choices can be made, that we probably should be a vanguard in that respect, without trying to be too prescriptive about it. Everybody has to make their own choices based on personal preference and health. But it's a good thing to talk about, because you think of your food choices as being habits that you can't change. And then when you have to change them, boom, you change them, and suddenly your old habits look ludicrous. So it's good to talk about it.
Back to a question of form. Isn't storytelling as such a way of expressing hope, as, for example, addressing the reader in Atwood's Handmaid's Tale? Could you perhaps comment on the intricate link between critical hope and telling stories of post-anthropocentrism?
Sure. Well, I mean, I personally have devoted my life to telling stories, but this comes from how much I loved to read fiction in particular when I was a child. But reading anything was a deep thrill, a kind of religious vocation. And I bet you there's many, many people in this group today who understand what I'm saying when I talk about that. The joy of reading drives you to writing in a dialectic that is very productive. And I also think that I judge that only about 25% of the American public read fiction for fun. It's a minority pursuit. Because you have to be able to do this mental operation in your head of turning sentences on the page into images and feeling in your mind. It's a co-creation, and it's not something that appeals to, or not something that everybody can even do. So, but amongst that, a minority, it's a crucial life activity. And for the rest, they too are addicted to stories. They just get them in different media. They get them through gossip, or they get them through movies, or TV, or they get them through direct transmission of storytellers. But in any case, all humans are addicted to stories, and many people would regard narrative as fundamental to epistemology, if not ontology itself, because we live in time, and one thing happens and follows another, and so we're just always so enmeshed in stories. So they're important. We construct our worldviews. Our worldviews are a story constructed from the other stories that we hear. That's very co-creative. And then when you start to try to tell stories that are like Brecht has this term, the Lernstücke, the learning piece or the learning play. These are very short, simple one-act plays that were meant to teach one point. That maybe, and even his greatest plays are obviously Lernstücke of a kind. We talk about the estrangement effect or the V effect in Brecht, but better, I think, to remember his term, Lernstücke, like, why are we being estranged? Cognitive estrangement in science fiction. Why would you do that? It's not just an aesthetic effect. It's a learning effect. It puts you off at an angle by which you can see your own life position from a new way, from a new angle, and learn to behave differently. So that's just an ongoing thing. And science fiction it's funny, science fiction is a very capacious and quite beautiful genre and community, in that it's very dedicated to silly fun, to wild thinking, to speculative craziness, but it's also intensely useful. So to be amongst the silliest works of art ever created in the 20th century, for sure, and to be amongst the most profound and important works of art of the 20th century, these aren't usually the same works of art, but it's the same genre. So this is what, in terms of all the stories that exist and the kinds of storytelling that are available to us today, particularly in the developed world, the technological West, where I come from, as an American writer, there's nowhere else that one should be if you want to do all these things at the fullest level possible, than to do science fiction. And maybe I could say Fantastica to take in all of the libidinal and sublimated and repressed craziness that you all are going to be talking about in this conference. In other words, there's a larger world of Fantastica that is wilder than science fiction usually is. And that's fine. Everybody chooses their own genre and mode. For me, science fiction's been the place to tell the stories best.
I'd be tempted to stop at that because it puts it all so well, but maybe one or two more questions if you can handle it. Yeah. There's a couple continuing the Anthropocene question, and that's bringing up Jason Moore's Capitalocene and Donna Haraway's Cthulhucene. And I wonder if you want to talk about extending the discussion in that direction.
Yeah, I have thoughts about that. That these, once you have the term the Anthropocene, then the Capitalocene is an alternative history. And so is the Cthulhucene. Although as much as I love Donna Haraway's work, I guess I haven't read that essay to understand exactly what the Cthulhucene is, but the Capitalocene is very clear, and it's an alternative history that is suggesting that if humanity had evolved and if history had happened such that a different political economy, a different power structure had evolved and replaced the capitalist history that we've lived in, that we would have had less impact on the rest of the world, on the biosphere, than we have had in this history. So that's why he wants to call it the Capitalocene, suggesting that if you had a socialism scene, you would have had fewer impacts on the biosphere. Well, I don't know. And here's the thing, alternative histories are weak rhetorically, because you can never be sure what would have happened if you change these things. And you never have a control, and you're never able to run that experiment in the real world to be sure whether your assumptions are right. I know this very well from my book, The Years of Rice and Salt. My attempts at an alternative history were of huge interest to me, but I saw very clearly that alternative history is rhetorically weak, because instead of saying, like science fiction does normally, this is going to happen, grabbed in the neck like the ancient mariner, you grab people by the collar and in their face you say, like an ancient prophet like Isaiah, this is going to happen. Well, rhetorically, that's very powerful. And it must go back into the Paleocene, the shaman by the fire tripping and yelling at his people, this is what's going to happen if you keep on in your foolish ways. That's often the subtext. Alternative history says, well, this did not happen, but if it had happened, it would have been very interesting. True, but less forceful as a statement. So I don't think that, as great as Jason Moore's work has been on these issues, I don't think that's a useful innovation. I don't think that's a useful new term, because we can't be sure. For sure, we need post-capitalism to get to a good Anthropocene. And that is the way you can unpack what he said in a way that I find useful. And I guess I could leave that at that.
Okay, maybe this will be a wrap-up question. As Le Guin notes, we are with and not for other animals. All of us are food in some way for others. The idea that consumption of others is inherently morally problematic and that humans can and should totally abstain from consumption of others, only serves to reproduce traditional human nature, animal-plant dualisms. Should the aim not be to move toward use that is not exploitative and non-reductive, but use of and impacts on others is an inevitable aspect of our entanglement with more than human worlds. No rigid boundaries between life and non-life, plants and animals, etc., exist in the natural world.
Well, Le Guin comes from her parents, the Krobers, anthropology, and she's very deep in that tradition, and it informs all of her writing in tremendously productive ways. I hear a lot of her father, but also Levi Strauss in that quote. And it's important to remember these physical facts, or the history of us as omnivores, and also as integrated into a complete ecological system, and all parts of that system have to be healthy for us to be healthy. I take that to be her point. And also what I would seize out of this is a kind of Le Guinian, very characteristic of her, I must say, an argument against purity. Don't be too pure. Don't judge. Don't try to pretend that we aren't always mixed creatures in a mixed universe. The Dalai Lama has very often said, we all have to burn some carbon, we all have to eat some food, and a lot of that food is made from living creatures, some of them sentient, some of them not, but then again, rocks have sentient. So he talks about mindful consumption. And I'll bet anything that Le Guin was also trying to point us towards mindful consumption, that we're living creatures in the world, we eat, we shit, we breathe, and all the other creatures that we're embroiled with in this one planetary biosphere are doing the same thing. And when you die, well, you might get cremated, or you might get eaten by bacteria that then will have their lives, etc. We're part of that biological cycle that I think what Le Guin's pointing to. But why? Well, maybe she's saying, don't be a purist, that the world isn't pure, you're not pure. Don't be judgmental and dogmatic. Try to be tolerant, try to be mindful. And I think that's probably a useful thing to be reminded of, and to maybe to close on here, because we're all now pretty deep into the social media world, our network, and there is a lot of purity, pretended purity, virtue signaling, judgmentalism, harsh judgment of the other, otherization, you might say, that is, and also the airlessness and intangibility of words on a page as opposed to people in a room. That means that the dangers of purity, of pretending to be pure, or even wanting to be pure, are probably important to keep pointing out, and say, look, keep the larger view of anthropology, of biology. Don't be so judgmental. Don't other the other. The other is, you've got to go back to Sartre and the existentialists. The other is really the look of the other is what creates you yourself, and you're in interaction with all that all the time. So I think this would be Le Guin's point from that quote, and I would say it's maybe a nice way to end, to say a little thank you to Ursula Le Guin for being so she was a leader in really important ways. So let's end with that.
I can't think of a better way to end. What a connection. Thank you, Stan, for your gift of the last few hours.
My pleasure. Thank you, Emra, and to everybody else with the organization. And thank you, Tom, for all your work and support through the years. And to the conference co-authors of this great novel, the program book, the crazy Gothic novel, have fun with it. It's going to be a fun conference, I can tell.
Thank you very much, Stan, and thank you very much, Tom, for this great talk and for this great keynote. Now, Nora will be, I think, closing the session. Yes.
Yes, hi everyone. Thank you so much. This was really fantastic discussion. Thank you, Kim Stanley Robinson and Tom. I know I've used several of your books, Stan, in my dissertation, so it's great to get to sort of meet you. So just a little update about how things will proceed. So we've finished the first really exciting day of the conference, and tomorrow we're going to start at noon Turkish time. We'll start directly with sessions. So if you go to the conference program, there are hyperlinks for each session, and each session has a unique link. So you will need to refer back to the program in order to access every session. If you're a chair, you should already have everything sorted with Teams. If not, shoot us an email. If you're participating, you just have to click on the link and it will put you into your session. Your chair will do the rest. So refer to the program, and we'll see you all at noon Turkish time tomorrow.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye all.